Tonight, we have two longer scary stories. A story of a single mother with some odd happenings at home, and another about a young man and his trip into the forest of Norway. Both of these stories were an absolute honor to narrate, so I hope you guys enjoy them as much as I did. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. You can either submit it at my subreddit r/slumberreads or my email you can find in the description. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. My baby boy has a lot of bad dreams. I didn't pay much attention to this new one at first. He woke me up screaming in the middle of the night last week. I'd only just gotten to bed too, after staying up late cleaning the kitchen. I was groggy and, I'll admit, a little pissed when I came into his room. Whenever he wakes up from a nightmare, he calls out to me in the same whimpering voice that breaks my heart and drives me crazy. "Mommy, I don't want to go. I don't want to go there." "Hush, it's okay, Sammy. You're safe." I sat at the foot of his bed and he leapt into my arms, burying his face in my chest. I stroked his hair. This was the third time in the last few weeks that he had woken me up like this. It was starting to be a problem. I wasn't getting enough sleep already, and it was affecting my work. But what was I supposed to do? Just let the kid cry himself back to sleep every night? I know how that feels. Never had anyone to hold me as a kid. I couldn't do that to him. This night was worse than usual. After 10 minutes, he was still clinging to me, whispering the same thing. "I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there." I checked the clock over his shoulder. It was 4. I had to be awake in less than 2 hours. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked him. "Where do you not want to go?" He stopped crying that second, and he looked me in the eyes. It's amazing how intense little kids can get. "I don't want to go to the Rickety house, Mommy. Don't make me go there." He melted into a look of sheer terror. "Oh, Mommy, please don't make me go there." He fell into my arms and wept. I held him close and rubbed his back, trying my best to soothe him, struggling to remember what my own mother would have said in this situation, and consciously saying the opposite. "Don't worry, baby. You stay right here with Mommy. You're safe." After nearly an hour, he stopped sniffling and his breathing became regular. "You're safe," I told him. I've probably said those words 10,000 times. More. I repeated them to myself in the silence of the night. I don't exactly remember falling asleep with him in my arms, but I do remember seeing the clock the moment I woke up the next day. 9. Fuck. I was late for work, and he was late for school. I looked at my phone. 20 text messages that I was too terrified to even open. Mercifully, my friend Betty was able to cover for me at the hospital. I called the school and told them that Sammy was sick. The lady sounded skeptical. Why hadn't I called earlier? She asked. Did I know that my son had already missed a concerning number of days this year? I told her that I knew that, but what are you gonna do? The kid's sick. She paused for a long time, her condescension congealing, so I just hung up. What a bitch. With Betty covering my shift, I knew I should spend the day catching up on cleaning. Instead, I lay in bed with Sammy watching TV until noon. For lunch, I made us grilled cheese. And with every bite, a voice in my head repeated, "You're a terrible parent." That voice sounds less and less like my mother these days, and more like me. I managed to do a little bit of ironing in the afternoon, but it wasn't even enough to distract me from the mountain of other chores I'd let fall behind. I hadn't even written my mother a thank you note for her help with the rent this month. I had 5 unheard voicemails, and my heart started thumping in my chest every time I thought about them. Sammy did some coloring while I folded his clothes. I looked down at him, wistfully. I loved watching him draw. He became so absorbed, so earnest. For him, the contents of his drawing were so much more real than anything in my far-off adult world. I longed for that kind of innocence. I tried to remember my own childhood, the last time I sat down and drew a picture. Sammy looked up at me, eyes wide, interrupting my daydream. "Mommy, look." He held up his drawing, and I bent down to admire his prize, but I frowned. I had never seen a kid make a drawing like this. There were no bright colors, no funny animals. He had used brown and black and gray, and the lines were eerily straight. "Sammy, what did you draw here?" I asked him, trying to hide my unease. He answered me quite plainly, like it should have been obvious. "That's the Rickety house, Mommy." It sure was. It stood on crooked stilts, 3 stories of brick and wood. The walls were all missing so you could see the foundation and the bones of the thing. The chimney went through the center like a spine. There was no furniture, no doors, no kitchen. It was like someone had tipped the house over and poured all of the life out of it. A wooden deck twisted around the house. In some spots, planks had fallen out of it, leaving big, yawning gaps. A thin railing girded it. But that too had collapsed in sections. Elsewhere, knobs and growths jutted out of the exterior like dislocated bones. Plumbing dangled out of the bottom of the house, and weather vanes stood at the top, stretching into the sky like a dead insect. I looked back at him and conjured up a tired smile from somewhere inside me. "It's very nice, Sammy. Is this from your dream?" He nodded at me solemnly and closed my hand around the drawing. "Now that I drew it, it can't be real. Right, Mommy? You'll put it on the fridge, and we won't ever have to go there. You promise, Mommy?" I looked at the drawing. Part of me wished I could just throw it away. "Sure, Sammy. We can hang it up. Of course." He gripped my hand tightly and looked me in the eye. "You have to promise, Mommy. Promise you'll hang it up, and that you'll never take me to the Rickety house." I gulped. "I promise." He nodded, confident I was being sincere, and then he lay down on the floor and resumed drawing. This time, thank the Lord, a picture of a cat. I set the picture of the Rickety house down, looked once more at its unsettling straight lines, and braced myself to see it every time I opened the fridge. The next 2 weeks were hell. Even with Betty covering for my absence, my boss still found reasons to be pissed off at me. I didn't clean the bathrooms fast enough. I missed a stall on the 3rd floor. I had a bad attitude. Every time I stopped working to catch my breath, he was right there waiting to chew me out. He was building up a reason to fire me. I could tell. He had never liked me. And why should he? I was flaky. I was a single mom. I never smiled at him when he complimented my assets. Still, home life made work feel like a picnic. Bills were piling up, and I knew that there was only so much longer I could tell my landlady. The rent check had gotten lost in the mail. I couldn't possibly ask my mother for help again. Groveling the last time had been bad enough. And Sammy, the poor kid, was falling apart at the seams, and I felt powerless to do anything about it. During the hour or two we were able to spend together in the evening, he clung to me like a scared puppy, wouldn't leave my side, randomly burst into tears sometimes, told me how much he missed me during the days. It was all I could do to keep from breaking down myself. What was I supposed to do? I was working every hour I possibly could, and it still was barely enough to keep him fed. I let him sleep in my bed more nights than I cared to admit. One day, I got a call from his school while I was at work. The woman on the other end smacked her lips when she talked. "Miss Fulcher, your son was sent to the nurse's office in hysterics today. We need you to come pick him up." My stomach sank. It wasn't even lunchtime yet. There was no way I could get out of work this early. "What do you mean hysterics?" I asked. "Is he sick? Did he get hurt?" "Physically, he is perfectly fine." She put too much emphasis on that first word. "He's just crying and asking for you. We're going to need you to come pick him up as soon as possible." At that moment, I saw my boss swaggering down the end of the hallway. "Shit." My son. Not quite as inaudible as I should have been. "Excuse me?" The woman said. "I'll be there," I said, hanging up the phone just in time as my boss walked past. He scowled, grunted at me to work harder, and stormed off. I did math in my head. There was no way I could sneak out, drive all the way to Sammy's school, take him home, and get back without the boss noticing. I couldn't even ask Betty for help. It was her day off. Screw it, I thought. I dropped the mop to the floor and bolted for my car. My temples throbbed with anxiety every second of my drive to Sammy's school. I had definitely lost my job. Where was I going to find another one? My boss would never give me a reference. Now that I thought about it, I probably wouldn't be able to get one from anyone I had worked for recently. A car cut me off, and I laid on the horn like a maniac. Why couldn't I just have a normal kid? I felt so angry at myself for thinking that about Sammy, that I missed my exit. As bitchy as the woman on the phone was, she wasn't wrong in her diagnosis. When I finally got there, Sammy was completely hysterical. He was curled up on a cot in the nurse's office, rocking back and forth and hyperventilating. His cheeks were raw from tears. Between whimpers, he repeated the same words. "Please, let me go home." I took his hand and walked him out, careful not to let the nurse see the shame on my face. On our way out, we passed a group of kids who pointed at Sammy and laughed. He didn't even seem to notice, just kept on crying even louder. All the way home, I tried to coax out of Sammy what had happened. Had another kid said something? A teacher? Was he feeling sick? He had no answers for me, only tears. I made spaghetti for dinner, his favorite, but he barely touched it. I put on a movie for him, and even let him sit on my lap, but he was inconsolable. I did notice that he looked fretfully at the drawing hanging on the fridge a few times, but I paid it little mind at the time. By the time he fell asleep, I had no better idea what had set him off. All I knew, I thought, as I laid him in bed and kissed him, was that it had better not happen again. The thought of having to find another job kept me from falling asleep, so I puttered obsessively into the night, reorganized the pantry, clipped coupons, wrote a letter to my mother thanking her, then crumpled it up into the trash. Finally, I broke down and opened a bottle of wine, just one glass. I told myself, but I emptied it fast. Another bottle soon joined it, and before I knew it, I collapsed on the couch, still in my makeup. I woke with a start to my phone vibrating. I'd slept in again. I had a momentary rush of relief when I remembered I didn't have a job to be late for, but then a secondary panic when I realized I had to take Sammy to school. Luckily, it was only 7:15. There was still time. If I threw on his clothes and shoved a Pop-Tart into his mouth as we rushed out the door. I was shouting at Sammy before I was in his room. "Sammy, come on. We're going to be late." I froze as soon as I opened the door. Sammy was not curled up in his bed asleep, but wide awake on the floor. He had rolled up his rug and tossed it into a corner. On the hardwood beneath it, he was busy at work. A picture, drawn with magic markers, stretched from wall to wall. He was working on it as I entered, sketching with a manic focus that my presence had not interrupted. Anger rose in my throat before I could even process what Sammy was drawing. I worked my ass off for this kid. Lost my job to pick him up when he breaks down crying at school, and he pulls this on me. God knows how long this would take to clean up. Without thinking, I stepped angrily towards him and wrenched the markers out of his hand. He looked up at me, as if broken from a trance. "Sammy," I shouted, not nearly as loudly as I wanted to. "What do you think you're doing? You know you can't draw on the floor. You know this isn't okay." His lip quivered. There were big circles around his bloodshot eyes, and I wondered if he had stayed up all night. "I had to draw this, Mommy. He told me if I didn't, we would both have to go to the Rickety house. He told me, Mommy. I promise. Please don't get mad at me. I had to do what he told me." Who told you?" I shouted as I grabbed a fresh change of clothes out of his closet. "The man," he said, as if it were necessary that I understand him. "The man at the Rickety house. He told me. I don't like him, but he never lies. He has no skin, Mommy. He has no skin, and he always smiles, and he never lies." I didn't have time for this. I pulled Sammy to his feet and dressed him. "Young man, you are in big, big trouble. We'll talk about this when you get home, but right now, you're going to school, and I don't want to hear one word." I dragged him to the kitchen and stuffed him into a pair of shoes. No time for brushing teeth today. I pulled into the carpool lane at Sammy's school and put the car in park at 7:59 on the dot. I jumped out the car, yanked open his door, and unbuckled him from his car seat like a ninja. Nobody was going to call me a bad mom today. A jobless loser, maybe. A nervous wreck? Definitely. But nobody was going to call me a bad mom. "Come on, Sammy. Time to go to school. You're running late." His face told me everything. The lip quiver, the sniffle, the dread in his eyes. He was seconds away from a complete meltdown. "Come on, Sammy," I said, my voice shaking. Other parents were starting to look at me. A car behind me in the line beeped. "Let's go to school. Don't you want to see all your friends?" He just shook his head. I tried again. "Sammy, you have to go to school today. You have to. Please, for Mommy." I held my hand out to him. He looked as pale as a sheet, but after a few seconds he slowly got out of his car seat, took my hand, and stepped out of the car. I cheered internally. For Mommy worked every time. I patted Sammy on the back and kissed him on the cheek. "Go have a fun day, kiddo," I said. He squeezed my hand, let go, and ran towards the school. Right as he put his hands on the door, though, he turned back to me and said quietly, "I miss Daddy." Then he was gone. As I walked back to the car with my heart breaking out of my chest, I couldn't even hear the chorus of honking cars and swearing moms. I felt sick all the way home. He was acting out. Of course he was acting out. I should have expected this. Everyone told me to. But did that mean I was supposed to just let him get whatever he wanted? Did I need to spend more time with him? Or give him more time by himself? This would all be easier if I could afford to get him a child psychologist. Or, hell, if I could get myself a psychologist. As it stood, I was out of money, out of options, and completely lost on what to do for this poor, impossible child. I knew I needed to look for a job, or at least call the hospital to see if I had actually been fired. Any one of the voicemails or text messages that I was ignoring would probably give me a hint, but I didn't dare look at my phone, and I couldn't even think about a new job without a panic attack setting in. So, I went for a long rambling walk through the neighborhood. That was what I needed. Just a chance to turn off my brain and head in no particular direction at all. I went past the playground where me and Jim used to take Sammy on Saturday afternoons. I went by the church we had dragged him to on Sunday. His screaming convinced us to never try it again. And we got pancakes instead. I had been so happy back then. We all had. I even went by the bar where Jim and I had first met all those years ago. A bar, such a funny place to meet. I told my mother we had met through work. I'm not sure why I lied about that. Jim never got the chance to ask me. I probably walked close to 5 miles before the hunger in my belly became unbearable. Half of a Pop-Tart in my pocket was all that I had eaten so far. I realized as I wolfed the rest of it down that I was still in the same clothes as the night before. There was even a hole in the knees of my jeans. That made me laugh for some reason. It was just all too much. As I came back to the apartment, I took some time to look at the construction they'd been doing on our block. Usually, I was in such a rush to get wherever I was going that I didn't even notice which houses were torn down, which old mom and pop shops had been replaced by the chains. There was very little of the old neighborhood left anymore. All the little brick one-stories and mini apartment complexes like my own were being bulldozed for expensive condos for expensive people. There was a luxury apartment building going up right across the street from me. In fact, a sign reading, "Now leasing, West Hill Towers," flapped in the wind above the construction site. I stared at the construction site, and it stared back. They were far along in the process, but it was still nothing but concrete foundations and steel girders. Scaffolding covered some sections, but in others, I could see straight through to the pit of earth below. There was no one working at this hour. Their lunch break, probably. I stood there, alone, with the skeleton of the building, counting its cage-like crossbars. I didn't know how big the property was, but as I stared through the interminable steel rib cage, it seemed to stretch backward infinitely. I lingered longer than a normal person should, perhaps. Blame the Rickety house. As soon as I got home, I headed back upstairs to Sammy's nighttime misdeed and determined how long it would take to clean. I thought to myself, with little comfort, that at least I didn't have anything else to do. What I found was startling. Although at first glance it had looked like pure scribble-scrabble, I found upon closer analysis that he had recreated his original illustration, only far more meticulously. This second, larger Rickety house wasn't just the bare outlines anymore, but a richly detailed labyrinth of crumbling construction and shambled rooms, staircases that went to nowhere, frameless doors that opened onto brick walls, a cracked bathtub in the middle of the living room, a small society mice living in the walls. None of the rooms had walls, paint, any finishing touches at all. Most were missing floorboards. I marveled for a long time at the complexity of the thing. Was my kid going to grow up to be an artist? Or maybe a psychopath? I tried to push aside such thoughts as I got on my hands and knees and began to scrub the damn thing away. It took a long time, longer than I thought it would, considering he had done it in magic markers, but the more I erased, the more little branches of the house I found. Extra rooms hidden under the bed, staircases climbing into the hallway. I swear that I scrubbed away the same damn parts of the drawing over and over again. I ended up going through a whole roll of paper towels. After nearly an hour though, I was finished. The room was clean, cleaner than it had been in months actually. I stepped back and admired my handiwork. I frowned and cursed out loud. In the corner of the room, in a spot I knew I had already cleaned, there was one last drawing, taunting me. I stomped over to it and dropped down onto my sore knees, paper towel drawn like a 6-shooter, and I stopped. For every other part of the drawing, Sammy had stuck with dull tones, grays, browns, charcoal black, but not this last, lingering detail. I'm not sure how I could have missed it. A man, standing at the edge of a balcony and waving. His eyes were wide, and he seemed to be staring straight out of the floor right at me. It gave me the creeps. He wore a gray suit, and his face and hands were a bright shock of scarlet. His smile, though, was wide and pearly white. "He has no skin," Sammy had said. "He has no skin, and he always smiles, and he never lies." I scrubbed, and I told all the voices inside my head to stop screaming, to shut up for once in my goddamn life. But they didn't listen. They never do. So I scrubbed, and I kept on scrubbing until my fingers bled. At the end of it though, the man on the floor was smiling even wider. My memory of the next few days is hazy. I know that I picked up Sammy from school after scrubbing his room that day. I remember hearing him sobbing in the back seat on the drive home, and not even being able to ask him what was wrong. Eventually he gave up, joining me in silence. I think that I got us McDonald's for dinner. I really couldn't tell you. I can recall only a few more lucid moments from that week, driving Sammy to school in the mornings, him asking me the occasional question, frightened by my quietness, sitting on park benches, staring into space, not thinking about work or the bills or the rent or anything at all. Waking up every morning with Sammy in my arms, unsure whether we fell asleep that way or not. It was like I was sleepwalking through life. I don't think I said 3 words the whole week. On Saturday morning, I snapped out of it. I woke up with a pounding headache, like a hangover, only far worse. My stomach was hollow, and every bone in my body was aching. Once again, Sammy was asleep in my bed next to me. I looked at his little sleeping face, illuminated by the first light of the morning, and I started to cry. I kept it quiet at first, not wanting to wake him, but once I started, the tears just came pouring out. It was like everything that had happened in the last week, the last month, the last 3 years, all caught up to me at once. Despite my best efforts, Sammy woke up to find his mother crying. "Mommy?" he said in a groggy voice. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" I sniffled, attempting to push away my emotions back where they belonged. "Don't be silly, Sammy. Mommies don't cry. Go back to sleep." I couldn't fool him though, and I couldn't stop my tears. Without saying another word, he wrapped me in a hug like a steel vice. I smiled a little and squeezed him back. As long as we stay right here and never let go of each other, I thought, nothing else can hurt us. Sammy said in a muffled voice, "Did he come to you last night too?" "Who, Sammy?" I asked him, dreading the response. "The man from the Rickety house?" "No, not him." Before Sammy could finish, the doorbell buzzed angrily, making us back into a world beyond the two of us under the covers. I groaned. Who would visit me at this hour? I checked the clock. It was almost 9 o'clock. Still too early on a weekend in my opinion. There was no way I could face any visitors. I kissed Sammy on the cheek and asked him for a familiar favor. "Sammy," I said, "can you look through the peephole and tell them I'm not home?" He nodded. He liked doing this, I think, because it made him feel like a grown-up. He bounded out of bed in his Buzz Lightyear pajamas, and I rolled back under the covers. As loud as my anxiety was screaming at me to get out of bed, the warmth beneath my comforter enticed me back into its sweet surrender. But as soon as sleep beckoned, Sammy's voice from the other room thrust me back out of it. "Mommy," he yelled excitedly. "Grandma's here. Can I let her in?" A familiar icy terror shot through my bones. I leapt out of bed like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, thinking over and over, "Not her. Not today. Please God, not her." I looked around the bedroom. Crumpled sheets had fallen to the floor, alongside several days' changes of clothes. A dirty plate sat accusingly on my nightstand. A pile of tissues overflowed from my wastebasket. If this was the bedroom, I shuddered to imagine what the rest of the house looked like. I heard Sammy again. "Mommy, Grandma wants to come in." "Just a second, Sammy. I'll come open the door." I frantically stuffed my dirty clothes in the hamper, made the bed one-handed while I wiped dust off my dresser with the other. It was no use. I shut my eyes to the mess in my room and tried to not look at anything else in the apartment as I made my way up to the front door. Sammy hovered by the door, jumping up to look through the peephole. I said a little prayer and undid the latch. My mother has terrific posture for someone her age. It's terrifying. She stood in my doorway wearing a purple coat with big buttons and holding a green handbag that I know for a fact costs more than I get paid in a year. She smiled at me, then instantly frowned. "Oh my God, Jennifer, you look terrible." She leaned down in the next beat to wrap her arms around and awaiting Sammy. "Oh, I've missed you, my big, strong, handsome Sammy. Jennifer, let me come in." "Sit down, for God's sake. You look like you're going to faint." "I'm really fine," I mumbled in protest as she pushed past me, grabbed me by the hand, and sat me down on the couch. "Did you get my text?" she asked me, fluffing a pillow and laying a throw blanket over me. "I said I was going to come take Sammy to the playground for you. Jesus Christ, you really don't look well. Have you been eating?" "Grilled cheese, spaghetti." I felt 5 years old again in her presence. She laid her hand across my forehead. You don't feel warm, but you're white as a sheet. Can't you learn to take care of yourself? I'll make some soup." I sighed, sat up, and tried to get off the couch. "Please don't make soup, Mom. I'm fine, just a little under the weather." "Don't you dare stand up," she snapped at me. She was already in the kitchen, rooting through my cabinets for pots and pans. She could never remember where I kept anything. "How you find anything in this place is beyond me." I could hear her murmur. I rolled my eyes. "This place is a sty, Jennifer. I'm surprised. What is that smell?" She hovered back into the living room, sniffing the air until she realized that the smell was, in fact, myself. She looked around the room, appraising it. Food stains on the sofa, muddy footprints in the rug, mouse droppings behind the TV. She spoke again with a tone of quiet horror. "Jennifer, honey, what's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," I tried to say. "Leave me alone. I'm a grown woman." I wanted to say, "I don't need you here, and I don't need your help." But none of the words came out. All I could muster was, "Sammy's been having bad dreams." And then the tears returned, and with them came the haze. Sammy played on the rug in front of me for the next few hours while my mother cleaned the house. I couldn't find the energy within myself to protest or join her. Guilt and shame registered as a distant throb that I knew I would deal with later. But for now, I had to just sit there and absorb my mother's comments as I watched Sammy move around his toy trains in serious, solemn patterns that only made sense in his mind. "And I told you to call me whenever things like this happened. I don't know why you don't just listen to me. You're just like your father that way. You know that, don't you? At least Jim always knew to call me when you got like this, regardless of everything else." I heard but did not comprehend as she prattled for an hour about my health, my prospects, my father, the sorry state of my house, and my life. I just took it because I didn't know what else to do. I took it and I stayed silent. At last, she stood in front of me with her hands on her hips. I could dimly tell that the house was clean again. Could see the dust stains on my mother's designer clothes. I warbled out a flimsy, "Thank you." I don't think she heard me. Honestly, it wouldn't have taken me so long to accept for Sammy's bedroom. Really, I'm shocked you let him draw on the walls. If your brothers had done anything like that when they were his age, your father would have taken out his belt so fast, it would make your head spin. "Mom, I don't... belt..." I paused. Something that my mother had just said threw me off. Draw on the walls. I had just cleaned that room the other day. Was it possible that he had... My mother pressed on before I could respond. "And what drawings? I don't know what kind of TV you're letting him watch, but if I were you, I'd cut it off right now. Boys that age should be drawing happy pictures, not unwholesome ones. You even had one of them hanging up on the fridge. Honestly, it almost gave me a heart attack. I took it out to the trash. You're welcome very much." Sammy jumped up like a shot, throwing his toy trains to the wind. "You can't throw away my picture. You can't, you can't, you can't." His face turned bright red, and he tried to run towards the kitchen, but my mother put out a hand to hold him back. "My goodness, young man. Jennifer, is that how you teach him to talk to his grandmother? Sammy, we can't draw those nasty pictures. It's not nice." Sammy screamed for my mother to let him go, and flailed his arms. For her part, my mother looked frightened. She'd never seen Sammy this way. "Jennifer, what on earth is getting into him?" I stood up on wobbly legs. I don't know where to begin with the picture. The rickety house. The man with the red face. The best option was to just leave it on set. The picture is important to him, Mom. Why the hell did you throw it away? I walked over to the kitchen trash and opened it up. "Jennifer, watch your mouth in front of your son. God, can you help me out with him? It's like trying to hold a seal." Sammy continued to squeal and try to wriggle out of my mother's arms. I didn't like to see her manhandling him that way. Unlike my father, I had never seen her hit a child, but she was still more tolerant of the idea than I was comfortable with. "I'll get the picture out of the trash and he'll be fine," I said, only I couldn't find it. The trash was empty. "Don't go rooting through the trash, Jennifer. What's wrong with you?" my mother said. Anyway, I took it out to the dumpster. That trash room is very scary. I hope you don't go down there by yourself. "You what?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If I couldn't get that picture back, Sammy was going to be inconsolable. I figured I was doing you a favor, but I won't bother next time. I was lucky too. The garbage truck came right after I did. Honestly, all this fuss over a picture... Her voice was cut off by a scream. "Ow, Sammy, no. You can't do that." I heard a clatter and a stampede of tiny feet. I knocked the kitchen trash can over as I ran into the next room. My mother was standing, holding her hand in pain. 3 pinpricks of blood lined across the knuckles where Sammy had bitten her. Sammy was at the front door, pounding on it like a lunatic. "Sammy?" I shouted. I ran over to him and scooped him up off the ground into my arms. Behind me, my mother was swearing. "You little brat." I ignored her and held Sammy in front of me. I looked him in the eyes and he looked back. I had never seen him so deadly serious. "Mommy?" he said. His voice was shaking with terror. "Mommy, we need the picture. We need the picture or he's going to make us go. We'll have to go with them. Both of us." I nodded and I set him down. I knew what I had to do. "Mom, I need you to watch him for a few hours. I'll be back." I heard her scoff in the next room. "You think I'm going to babysit for you now? Jennifer, I may have to get stitches. That boy is out of control. I'm warning you." "There's band-aids in the medicine cabinet." Without another word, I opened the door, slammed it shut, and ran down 3 flights of stairs to the street without stopping. At the far end of the street, I could see the garbage truck at a stoplight. I took off like a jungle cat. I don't know where I found the energy to run that day. I should have collapsed in the street. Some primal maternal drive pumped adrenaline through my veins, allowed me to ignore my heart fighting its way out of my chest, my lungs begging for mercy. I barreled through groups on the sidewalk. Some guy flipped me off. Dogs barked. Cars honked. But my mind was of singular focus, thinking only of what would happen if I didn't get that drawing. Still, the truck stayed just out of my grasp, and when it took a right at an intersection before I rounded the corner, it left my sight. I stopped in the street and dry heaved. This was it. It was late in the day. It was undoubtedly bound for the dump. A few passerbys gave me dirty looks. This out-of-shape woman in her pajamas sprinting like an Olympian, but I didn't care. I just heard Sammy's cries of fear ringing through my ears. I stepped onto a crosswalk, and a car sped past me, missing me by less than an inch. I jumped back onto the sidewalk, awakened from my stupor with a jolt. I could feel where the car had grazed against my skin. Death had just knocked on my door, and I had very nearly answered. It was fitting, actually, because as I looked around the intersection, which I had thought I recognized, I realized exactly where I was. The corner of Prince and Tulip. I'd avoided driving past here for over 2 years. This was the street where Jim was killed. The next moment, the whole world went quiet. The birds in the trees, the cars on the street, the people walking by, every sound faded away, slowly at first, until all I could hear were my own footsteps. The sun felt funny on my skin, and I looked up and realized that was because it had disappeared. A large black cloud had passed over its face and cast the world into shadow. This is all in my head, I thought. It wouldn't be the first time. I tried to repeat this mantra to myself and focus on walking back home. My mother would be wondering where I had gone. Sammy was probably terrified. These practical concerns fought for the attention of my mind, but they did so in vain. My rational mind retreated as I tried to retrace my steps and realized I was completely lost. I had wandered into a neighborhood of old houses, big, Victorian things with dead grass in the lawn and spiky iron gates, peeling paint and towers and widow's walks. I tried to stay out of this part of town, both because of Jim and because the houses themselves didn't want me there. It had been so long since I had come this way that I had completely forgotten the way home. When I finally found it, or when it found me, I was almost relieved to be face to face with the thing, just past a bridge, over the river, and across from a vacant lot. There I found it, the Rickety house. Without a second thought, I pushed open a half-rotted wooden gate and walked through. I walked past a stack of broken doors in the yard, hidden by the tall weeds, and I just stared at the Rickety house. It was as Sammy had drawn it and more, immense but unfinished, imposing like an enormous, decaying corpse. It climbed and climbed and climbed, and when I tried to count the stories, I got dizzy. With no walls, I could look straight through to the center too, but no matter how far I peered in, I couldn't see through to the other side. All within was darkness, an endless row of wooden beams and rusty nails, a pit with no bottom. I ducked under a beam and entered. Everywhere I went, the construction of the Rickety house defied logic. Staircase supported by splintering boards, rooms in the back of the house with windows that opened to the front, rooms with no floorboards that somehow held furniture anyway. Even though I stayed on the first floor, half the rooms boasted a view from 5 stories up. Before long, I didn't know where I was any longer. In the back of my mind, I knew that I had made a terrible mistake, that I needed to find a way out of the Rickety house soon, or I was never going to leave it at all. But just as I had been drawn inside the house, I found no will inside of me to leave its decrepit hallways behind me, as the floorboards creaked beneath me, and I could feel every wind outside causing the whole structure to sway. I only desired to go deeper and deeper into the Rickety house. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, quite the opposite, in fact. The more rooms I walked through, the more I lost. My thoughts, my emotions, my fear. Soon I had all but forgotten my name. I was in thrall of the Rickety house, and I knew that if I allowed it to, It would chew me up, and I would never see Sammy again. Sammy. Remembering his name turned something back on in my head. Remembering his big, serious eyes and the way that they looked when he was scared to death. Remembering how it had felt to wake up with him that morning. And remembering that I would do anything in the world to keep him safe. I'm not in this alone, I thought, as I returned to consciousness. I have to get out of here for Sammy. The moment I had this thought, the whole house quaked, and I could swear that I heard a huge and angry roar. I ran through the rooms blindly, never looking back, completely unsure if I was going in the right direction. I tried to just go straight, and kept running into walls, so I pushed through every door I could find, desperate to reach an exit, a window, any way out. The house continued to shake around me, and howl after my escape. Beams fell from the ceiling to block my path, but I simply vaulted over them. Doors slammed in my face, and floors collapsed beneath me, but none of them were going to keep me from my son. Do your worst, I shouted. I'm not scared of you. I heard one last pained roar from the distant center of the house. Suddenly, I felt myself sliding forward as the floor beneath my feet began to tilt. I could hear nails being stripped from wood, and great big foundations being pulled from ancient earth. The entire house was toppling back and forth with me inside. Oh no, you don't, I thought, defiant to the last. I was practically standing on the ceiling now, but I wasn't going to give up. I leapt through the air and grabbed a doorknob. As I turned it, the house began to tilt the other way. The door opened outward and I tumbled through it, off of a balcony, over the fence, and flat on the vacant lot across the street. I sat there for a long time, holding my aching leg. If I was lucky, I had only broken one bone, but the tears in my eyes were not from pain, but from relief. I had escaped. The rickety house would not have me today, and neither would I let it have Sammy. I looked back across the street, grinning defiantly at the crumbling colossus, and I screamed. The house was still intact, and still in the ground as if it had never moved. I couldn't even see the balcony where I had escaped, but standing on the spiraling deck, 4 stories up, was a familiar figure. His face was wet and pink, and I could count the delicate veins as they throbbed against his forehead. His eyes, lidless, were startlingly human. He held up a muscly, sinewed hand, waved politely to me, and tapped his wrist. He was wearing a watch. Soon, he mouthed at me. We nodded at each other, and he turned around and vanished into the rickety house. I limped back through the neighborhoods towards home. Now I could remember the path quite well, and was mad at myself for ever forgetting. As I walked, I thought of my mother with a familiar mixture of frustration and pain fondness. Maybe she could stay with us for a few days while I looked for a new job. She would like that, and I probably wouldn't murder her. I also thought of Sammy. I thought of how much I loved him, and how much he drove me crazy, and how much he reminded me of Jim. But mostly, I thought of one small detail, one that seemed insignificant, but I kept rolling over in my head. Sammy had told me that the man with no skin always smiled, and I don't think that was quite true, because if you have no skin, it also means you have no lips. It was a small detail, but an important one, because if he did have lips, I don't think he would have been smiling at all. Let me just start by saying that I've never been much of an outdoorsy person. I grew up in the city in the States, so there weren't a lot of opportunities for me to bask in the wonders of nature. Even if there were, I still wouldn't budge from my couch and Nintendo just to get a glimpse of some plants and a ray of sunlight. No, I'd rather stay inside and waste my youth away in front of the television, just like the other teenagers my age. On the few occasions I would venture outside, it would be just a quick walk to the local park to meet up with some of my friends to share a cigarette or two, along with a couple of beers. You know, the usual teenage behavior. Naturally, my mother grew worried. She thought that I wasn't getting the natural benefits a kid my age ought to have, but she was seldom vocal about it. She was a single mother and sole provider for me and my younger brother, as our father died some time ago. So she had to work most of the time to provide for us all. Therefore, she wasn't around very often to dictate what we were or weren't supposed to do, which suited me just fine. During the summer before my first year of high school, however, she arranged for me and my brother to visit some family in Oslo in Norway, because she thought that this was the perfect time for us to get out for a bit. My mother's sister, Aunt Lucy, had lived with her Norwegian husband and their son for the past 2 decades or so, so her mother thought it would be a good opportunity for me and my brother to get, as she called it, some quality time outside with family. Like all the opportunities I had gotten before, I was quick to decline this one as well, as I had no interest in going to Scandinavia to meet a family that I barely called twice a year. However, my mother stomped her foot down against my refusal and was adamant that my brother and I went along with it. Despite my initial rejection of her idea, as well as my general lack of interest, I agreed after some amount of persuasion from my mother's side. She said that if I agreed, then she would buy me a new game console to waste my time on. My Nintendo had grown rather old and didn't work like it used to before, so I eventually accepted her terms, albeit reluctantly. My brother and I left the following week. It took us a couple of flights to get to Oslo, and when we finally arrived, my first impression of Norway was already established. Cold. Even in the middle of summer, it felt like an ice house there in comparison to my home city. As we waited at the airport for our relatives to arrive and pick us up, I felt like an alien standing amongst humans. The people were talking in a language that I had little prior knowledge about, and while my brother and I were standing there in our thick layered clothing and scarves, the locals were dressed rather casually and, dare I say, scantily. I guess they were more accustomed to the temperature than we were, and even found it comfortable enough if they dressed as thinly as they were, whereas we were chilled to the bone. When our aunt and her family finally came to the airport, they greeted us with open arms, and I can admit that the hospitality was welcoming. I didn't stand close to my aunt and her family, not as much as I would have wanted to, and we seldom saw each other. At most, we would exchange a few letters or phone calls over the year, but we rarely, if ever, met face to face. To spend a couple of weeks with them was a huge step, but even though I was hesitant, I tried my best to welcome the change. Besides, it wasn't like I could do anything about it. Our cousin's name was Jonas. He wasn't much older than me, and since we shared a couple of hobbies such as gaming, it helped break the ice knowing that there was someone I could relate to. All of us spent the first couple of days getting to know each other better than we had before. The family lived in a privileged 2-story house on the outskirts of the city, which had been renovated only a few months prior. It was a good place to stay, and I found myself enjoying it there far more than I had initially anticipated. Our aunt and uncle were treating me and my brother as though we had known each other far longer than we really had. But since my uncle was Norwegian, he occasionally struggled with a few English terms. Nonetheless, I appreciated the efforts. Our uncle was a wildlife biologist and was often absent from his family because of his work. During our stay there, however, we would all be going with him to the dense Norwegian forests a bit further from the city, while he worked on some projects with the colleagues, which involved observing some animals there. We would be staying in a cabin that the family owned but seldom used, and he promised us that we would have the time of our life there. At first, I wasn't sure about this idea. After all, I wasn't too keen on the prospect of going into the wilderness, as I would rather stay at the house to play games with my cousin. However, after Jonas too insisted that we would have a great time, and after my little brother became thrilled about it as well, I knew that I had lost against their argument. We left for the cabin a couple of days later. The drive there took us a few hours, and as the view of the vast city gradually vanished into the distance, I was quick to take note of the Norwegian landscape. I had seldom seen so many trees, plants, and fauna where I came from, and I had to admit, it was rather beautiful to look at. The sounds of birds singing in the distance, and the wind blowing the branches of the trees, brought out a sense of serenity in me that I didn't know I had needed, nor yearned for. And the majority of my discomfort vanished like dust in the wind. By the time we arrived at the cabin, it was already dark outside. To my dismay, the place wasn't as reinvented as the house back in Oslo. It was a 1-story cabin with one of those dry toilets outside that you couldn't flush with water. you could basically just piss or shit in a hole, and that would be it. The cabin itself seemed old-fashioned and ancient, like it had been built several centuries earlier in a time period far less advanced than this one. Fortunately, it had electricity, but only to manage the lights. And there wasn't any signal there either, so having our phones there was essentially useless. We were practically stranded in the middle of the forest with only trees stretching for miles. And had it not been for the car, it would have taken us days to reach civilization on foot. Despite its lack of modernity, the cabin was accommodating enough. It had a kitchen, a storage room, and what seemed to be a living room. They had ordinary commodities like couches and a table, not to mention a fireplace that was used to regulate the temperature in the place. However, since the cabin only had 2 bedrooms, the 3 of us boys had to share one of them, whereas our aunt and uncle shared the other. The room we slept in was barely large enough to house 1 person, much less 3. And to make matters worse, Jonas was the only one with a bed. My brother and I had to lie in sleeping bags on the floor. And the lack of spaciousness, as well as the sound of my brother nightly sleep-talking, didn't make it easy to doze off. So I spent the majority of my evenings lying awake in my bed, next to my somniloquist of a brother. We spent the first days making ourselves at home in the cabin. While it took some effort on my part, I eventually came to find some sense of appreciation for the solitude. Well, I wouldn't call it immense fondness per se. I would still much prefer my Nintendo and warm bed over what I visibly had at my disposal, but given the circumstances, I was in no place or shape to make demands. We ate food warmed on the stove, drank fresh water from a well close to the cabin, and spent the evenings playing cards or board games with one another before we called it a night. Our uncle would occasionally take us deeper into the forest to get a look at the animals there, and we would be lucky if we caught a glimpse of a moose or a fox. All in all, things could have been considerably worse, but the one thing I never grew accustomed to was the toilet. It reeked with a hideous stench, and going there was always an ordeal, especially in the middle of the night when it was pitch black outside. One night, after having failed to fall asleep once again because of my brother's consistent sleep talking, I felt the need to use the damn toilet. At first, I tried to hold it, but to no lasting success. I got up from my sleeping bag and headed out of the house with a flashlight. It was deathly quiet outside, and the darkness shrouded the deep and dense forest in a way that only added to the eerie atmosphere. I wasn't used to that kind of silence, and quite frankly, it was unnerving to listen to. I felt watched in a way that I couldn't describe, and I would occasionally hear a twig being snapped or branches brushing against each other. That alone made me feel separated from the rest of the world, and the longer I stared into the dark abyss, the more it seemed like it was staring back at me. Without wasting time, I quickly went to the dry toilet and shut the door behind me. The smell was ever so revolting, but I swallowed the contents of my stomach down and went ahead and did my business. When I was done, I was about to head back inside the cabin when I discovered my brother standing on the porch, looking out into the distance with this vague glimpse in his eyes. Initially thinking he was simply sleepwalking, again, I was about to nudge him back inside when I realized that he was fully awake. "What are you doing out here?" I asked him. "Do you want me to follow you to the bathroom?" "I was just listening to the music," he answered, not sounding like he was entirely there. "The music?" I asked and looked back at the forest. I didn't hear anything but the usual forestry sounds that the trees produced, so naturally, I thought he was just hearing things because he was still half asleep. However, I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being washed through the tree line, and would rather not stick around to find out. My brother pointed at the forest and into the nothingness between the trees. "She's playing her tune, and she wants me to follow her." I wanted to ask him what it was he meant, but I knew that I wouldn't get any reliable answers from him, so I took him by the shoulder and led him back inside the cabin. Surprisingly, he let me do so without fighting back, and simply faltered through the door like a zombie. Taking this as a sign that he had simply heard things, I was about to shut the door behind us when I heard what sounded like a violin playing in the distance of the trees. It was a beautiful tune, like something straight out of a musical. I glanced back at the darkness, and I thought I saw a pair of reflective orbs looking at me, like those of a cat in the night. I wanted to follow them and figure out where they led to, but since I had to see my brother back to the room, I hesitantly shut the door and guided him in. Jonas was still sound asleep in his bed. After putting my brother into his sleeping bag, I finally succeeded to fall asleep as well. The dream I had that night was strange and intoxicating, like having a sip of liquor and finding it to your liking so much that you drown in a barrel of it. I was standing near a pond in what appeared to be an open clearing in the middle of the forest, yet everything around me seemed distorted. The water in front of me was dark and murky, seemingly bottomless. Then, a figure emerged from the depths of the pool, and I froze as I laid my eyes on it. It was a beautiful woman in the middle of the pond, untouched by the cruelties of the world in a way that I couldn't even comprehend. Her skin looked pale and smooth like alabaster, and she had unearthly long, dark hair that was reached down to the black waters below, making it seem like her hair was one with it. Her eyes were equally black as though the night had swallowed them whole, and yet they looked at me in a way that could make even a mother's loving gaze pale in comparison. She reached one of her arms up from the water and beckoned for me to come to her with a flick of a finger. She smiled in a way that was as seductive as it was ambiguous, and yet I still found myself complying with her silent demands. Without any will in my body to withstand her orders, I made my way into the water to join her. The pond felt cold against my skin, but I didn't as much as fidget as I began to swim to where she was. It was all I wanted, it seemed. The closer I got, however, the more her facial features began to contort themselves into that of a monstrous creature. Her once beautiful neck developed gills that oozed some kind of tar-like substance. Her smooth skin became covered in fish-like scales, and her face, her beautiful face, shifted into that of an inhuman creature with razor-sharp, blood-drenched teeth. She smiled at me so sinisterly that nothing could compare to it. Before I could turn back, she grabbed me by my neck and pulled me down beneath the dark waters. I kept thrashing and struggling in her grip, but her nails dug into my flesh like a pair of knives and kept me under until everything faded to complete blackness that matched the pond. I woke up with a startle, gasping for air, and feeling as though I had just spent all of my energy and breath on running a marathon. My clothes were soaked thoroughly with sweat, as though I had really been diving in cold water the night before, and my neck ached painfully from where I had been grabbed in the dream. Needless to say, the sensation wasn't welcoming in the slightest, and I spent a couple of minutes catching my breath there on the bedroom floor. Even though it was so early that the sun was barely up, I decided to get ready for the day. I was already awake and doubted that I would be able to fall back asleep again, so what was the point in lying about? As I got to my feet and onto the cold floor, I felt like I stepped in something wet. Looking down, I discovered a trail of wet footsteps that led from the foot of my sleeping bag and out the front door of the cabin, which had been left wide open by whoever had entered. Being the logical individual that I was, I initially assumed that I had just been sleepwalking, or maybe my brother again. Hell, maybe it had been Jonas, or our aunt, or our uncle. Either of those assumptions was plausible, but something in the back of my brain told me that none of those alternatives were correct. Besides, why would it be wet? When everyone gathered around the kitchen table for breakfast that morning, I still asked if anyone had left the front door wide open, or if they had gone to our room in the middle of the night. I knew that it was a stupid question, and just the way my aunt looked at me indicated that none of them knew what I was talking about. So I ignored the subject altogether and tried to turn to the more logical explanations for compensation. It was probably just my brother after all, and he had gone walking in and out of the house in his sleep again. Nothing more than that, and nothing less. The ache in my neck, however, didn't lessen that morning, nor did the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That day, our uncle would be occupied with some colleagues in the area, so he suggested that the three of us boys went fishing in a pond that was located a little further up in the forest. The word pond was enough to send shivers down my spine, but I tried to ignore it, and went along with the idea for the sake of getting my mind on something else for a change. After packing our equipment, me, my brother, and Jonas headed into the woods on our own, while Aunt Lucy stayed behind to prepare food for later. Being on our own made me feel like a grown-up, and soon enough, that horrible nightmare was washed off my mind. like a stain of ketchup on my shirt, though the pain on my neck served as a constant reminder of what I had dreamt of. The walk didn't take too long, maybe half an hour or so. As we went, I couldn't help but notice that my brother was acting a little bit different. He was usually chirpy and always had something to say, but he was quiet and didn't as much as utter a sound as we walked. It was unnervingly uncharacteristic of him, and being the caring, albeit occasionally pushy brother that I was quick to put a question mark on it. "What's up?" I asked him as we neared our destination. "Are you okay?" He looked at me with those same empty eyes he had the night before. Then he broke into a smile. "I'm just focusing on the music," he said, and I was reminded of what he had told me the night before. "The same music?" I asked, and stopped for a moment to listen, but didn't hear anything. "The music she plays, she's good with the violin." "Who's she?" "The lady by the pond, the same one that visited us last night." I halted in my steps as I heard this. "Visited us? What are you talking about?" "She left you a kiss." He earnestly poked at my throat. "Don't you remember?" I touched my neck as he said this. While there was no mark of any kind on my skin, I could still feel the ache there as vividly as I could in that dream. I wouldn't exactly call that a kiss, and I most certainly wouldn't go as far as to say that I fully believed a woman had given it to me in my sleep. "No, I don't remember it," I said. My brother only looked at me in a way that I didn't find comforting. His eyes remained hollow as the night, almost bottomless like the pond from my dreams. He didn't say a single word, but that alone was enough to send shivers down my spine. After a few seconds, he reassumed with walking, and I promptly followed behind. When we finally arrived, I noticed that the pond in front of us looked eerily similar to the one from my dream. The clearing in the forest seemed the same. The water was a little less murky, but still haunting to look at, and the feeling of isolation struck me like a slap to my face. I expected the creature from the depths to emerge and drown us all, but there was nothing there. Still, as much as I wanted us to leave, I knew that I would put brakes on Jonas's fun. After all, he seemed the most excited about going to the lake. At first, I thought it was because he wanted to fish, but when he started stripping down to his boxer shorts, I knew his intentions were to dive straight into the water instead. "Isn't it cold?" I asked as I tried to dissuade him from going in. "Are you sure it's safe?" Jonas laughed as he threw his clothes next to his bag. "It's fine. There's nothing here. I promise. Come on, it'll be fun." "I don't think you should go." I persisted and put my bag down on the grass. "There could be something in the water." "It's fresh, so I doubt it." Jonas added dismissively, "If you're not going to do it, then I'm not going to force you. I ain't got those same reservations." And with that said, he jumped right into the water with a loud splash and disappeared beneath the murkiness until no trace of him could be seen from the surface. I wanted to go in after him, but just as I was about to pull off my shoes, he re-emerged from the water with a shit-eating grin on his face. "Told you it was fine," he said, and began to swim further away on his back until the distance between us grew quite prominent. As I watched my cousin relax in the water, a wave of relief washed over me. Maybe I had just been overthinking things. Of course, it was just a nightmare, and everything would turn out fine. I continuously tried to put the image of the disfigured woman behind me, but as I turned to my brother and discovered that he too had stripped down into his underwear, my alertness came back like a switch that had been flicked. "You're not going in there," I said as I grabbed him by the arm, but he shook my hand off him with ease. "The lady is waiting for us," he said faintly, and pointed at where Jonas was swimming in the water. "There is no lady in the water," I insisted. "It was just a dream." "But she's waiting for us." "No, she's not." I reached to grab him again, but before I could, he jumped into the water and made his way over to where Jonas was. My stomach plummeted to the bottom of my abdomen like a 10-pound brick as I watched him go, and a million thoughts rushed through my head. I didn't know why though. I mean, it was just a bad dream, and as far as I could tell, the woman wasn't anywhere to be seen. She was just that, a part of a dream, and I had nothing to worry about. I started to feel relaxed enough to take off my shoes, and then the rest of my clothes until I stood there in just my underwear. Just as I was finished undressing, I started to hear what sounded like a violin playing close by. The same beautiful tune I had heard from last night echoed through my eardrums, and I was starting to debate whether I had truly lost my mind. I listened closer and realized that it was coming from the pond, as though whoever was playing the instrument was tumbling with it from beneath the depths of the water. Then, I heard Jonas let out an ear-deafening scream from where he was, and upon snapping my attention to him, I saw her. The deformed woman from my dream stood there in the water, with her bony, scale-covered arms stretched towards Jonas in an effort to grab him. He quickly swam away and out of her reach, but just as it seemed like he was out of immediate harm's way from the creature, my brother suddenly emerged from the water right next to him and proceeded to pull him under. Despite my brother being roughly 90 pounds or so, and rather skinny for his age, he managed to pull our older cousin under with seemingly little difficulty. I watched in paralyzed horror as Jonas' head fell beneath the murky water whilst his arms waved above the surface in a futile effort to regain his breath. The woman, or whatever it was, watched the spectacle in front of her with evident bemusement. Even though the waters were deep, she stood completely still, like she didn't need to move in order to stay afloat. Her black eyes were aimed at the view, and when she tilted her head to look at me, I was completely frozen. Even as I watched my brother drown my cousin, I couldn't move a single muscle for the duration of it. The woman's lips parted and her razor-like teeth shone like diamonds in the sun, and she smiled a malevolent, vicious smile that not even the devil's grin could compare to. Jonas' arm stopped moving and gradually descended to the water. My brother still held his body down and didn't seem moved by the act of murder in the slightest. His face was void of any kind of remorse or emotion, and for a moment, I doubted it was even my brother. My brother couldn't as much as kill a fly without bursting into tears, so this was something entirely otherworldly. He then looked up at me, and I saw that his eyes had turned completely black like the pond he was swimming in. Just like the woman's eyes, he began to make his way over to her and embraced her like she was our mother. The creature enveloped her arms around him in return, and they both turned up to look at me with those equally black eyes. Then, each of them stretched an arm towards me without letting go of one another, and they called out to me. "Come to Las," they said in perfect unison, and I could only describe the sound of their voices as hollow and inhuman. While my Norwegian skills were questionable at best, I knew what they were saying. "Come to us." At that moment, it felt like my body had gotten a mind of its own because I no longer felt like I was the one in control. Like a puppet with strings, I began to walk towards the edge of the pond with the intent of jumping in. I wanted to come with them. It was like being a child again, and being called to your mother for a hug. It was all I could focus on. I didn't seem to care about the fact that my cousin had just been drowned in front of my own very eyes, and the image of his body floating somewhere down in the water was erased from my mind like markings on a piece of paper. I can't describe how or why, but the second my toes made contact with the cold water, I snapped out of my trance and sprinted as far away from there as I could manage. I didn't even bother to get dressed or to bring our stuff with me. I just ran as fast as I could without stopping for a moment. My bare feet ached as I stepped over rocks and branches on the path back to the cabin, where I found my aunt preparing lunch on the porch. When she saw me, she instantly knew that something was wrong. I tried to tell her what happened, but my lungs were completely empty of oxygen, and my body barely possessed enough energy to stand. In fact, I fainted right there on the porch, and I don't remember much of what happened after that. However, I recalled seeing the hideous woman in the pond. I remember seeing my brother still there with her, and I remember hearing the beautiful but nightmare-inducing violin music ringing in my ears. Years have gone by, and nothing ever came out of the investigation that was launched. They never found my brother, or my cousin, or that deformed woman for that matter. No matter how many divers they sent into the pond, there was absolutely nothing there. My family tried to have me mentally evaluated, since what I told them made no sense. In a way, I couldn't really blame them, but even after I was deemed perfectly sane, my answers still couldn't provide them with any clues. They simply thought I was in shock, and because they didn't find any bodies, my brother and cousin were simply reported as missing. My mom hasn't been the same since. Her once lively and energetic self died the moment she heard about what happened to my brother. I no longer see her smiling like she used to, and whenever I bring the subject up, she will shun me like a plague and lock herself inside her room, or simply pretend like she didn't hear anything at all. I don't hear much from my aunt or uncle anymore either. I'm not going to go as far as to say that they blame me for what happened to their son, but I can tell that simply talking over me over the phone brings them immeasurable pain. I'm also saddened by the loss of 2 valued members of my family. But what weighs me down even more is the fact that I'm not the only one who's aware of what really happened to them, and I can't tell anyone. I guess that's why I'm posting this here. I'm trying to get some kind of closure, but I can't seem to get any closer to putting what happened to me behind me. As much as I've tried, it doesn't really help that I still hear the grotesque melody in the back of my mind wherever I go, and I still see those pitch black, inhuman eyes in my sleep. I have nightmares about the event to this day, and when I wake up, I find that my clothes are soaked with sweat, and my floorboards are covered with puddles of water. The creature is still out there. I know it. It's someplace back in Norway, killing people just like it had with my little brother and my cousin, and it still yearns for me, the one who got away. One day, I might go back there to bring an end to it, but something tells me that I won't return. I hope I do. I sincerely do, but that thing isn't human. It has some kind of effect on people that makes them bend to its will. If I return, I doubt I'll be as lucky as I was back when I was a teenager.